Hello and welcome to the latest installment of Cincy Rim's Roll Call. I'm Adam Visnick, your host once again, and today we are diving deep into the world of risk and insurance management. Today, let's unravel the journey, the challenges, and the victories that our next guest has encountered. Please join me in welcoming David Cassity.
David, thanks for having me, Adam.
Welcome aboard. It's an honor and a privilege. And let's jump right in. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in your risk management career.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I would say in my generation, I sort of fell into it on accident and didn't start out to be a career plan. But I went to a small college in Cincinnati called God's Bible College, and I thought I'd be sort of traveling the world and doing social work for my career. But I got out of my BA and figured out that you have to do a lot of fundraising in order to do that line of work. And I really, really disliked the fundraising aspect. And I thought, man, I've got to pivot. I've got to figure something else out. At the time, I was working at the Westin Cincinnati Hotel downtown and started to get into management roles. And I thought, this sort of business thing is working out and it's going really well. And I was going to relocate to Springfield, Ohio, and looked for who's the largest employer in Springfield, Ohio. And at the time, it was a company called Assurant. So Assurant does lender-placed insurance. And so that's where I got my first sort of toe in the water from an insurance and risk perspective. And I started doing personal lines home ownership claims for large banks. So think, Wells Fargo, Citi Mortgage, et cetera. Because when that check gets cut for a loss, it gets cut to both the bank and the homeowner. And so we have to monitor those repairs to make sure that the homeowner doesn't spend the funds on something they're not supposed to, which we've had before. We've had homeowners spend money on sheep and cars and all sorts of fun things. So, but in going to Assurant, I really started to get into large volume claim processing. So we did about 60,000 claims annually. We had over 100,000 customer interactions on the phone, and we were dispersing about $500 million in claim funds every year. So, think big data, think large processes. And so that's where I started to get. And so I stayed at Assurant for about 6 years and was sort of getting into a place from a career standpoint where everyone else was far senior than me. They weren't going anywhere. I was sort of in my, late 20s. And I didn't see a career path going forward. So I started to sort of put some feelers out there. And my wife, she works as a recruiter, and she goes, well, I'll look and see kind of what's out there and see if I can find you a role. And so she found this company called Trimble and had a risk analyst position open. And for most of the people viewing this, the risk analyst is a pretty sort of junior level position, entry level, doing commercial insurance. And so she submitted my resume, and I started to look at the job description. I said, Trisha, I don't really know how to do much of what's listed on this job description. And she said, don't worry about it. They're going to call you in a few days and you'll interview and they'll like you and they'll probably end up hiring you. And I said, okay, well, I think you're crazy, but all right, whatever. Sure enough, a few days later, I got the call to come in for an interview, interviewed with the assistant treasurer at the time. And I was very honest. I said, look, here's what I know. Here's what I don't know. But my commitment is that if you hire me for this position, I'll close that gap within 12 to 18 months, and I'll make sure that you're never sorry that you hired me. And so I took a big risk, right? I was taking a job I didn't know a lot about, taking a job with a brand new company, had a family at home. And so I took the leap, and I said to myself, if in 2 years I can't meet the career goals I want here, I'll probably need to exit. But that 2 years has now turned into 9 years. And at Trimble, I've been able to sort of expand my horizons around risk management beyond commercial insurance. I now do things like business continuity. I do environmental health, safety, and security. I do crisis and incident management. I do enterprise risk management. So I've had the opportunity to really build out my risk management skill set. And so taking that risk has really opened up my career path tremendously.
That's awesome. And firstly, let me just say shout out to Trisha, your wife, for for having ultimate faith in you as in your career trajectory as an employee. From personal experience, shout out to my wife too for the same belief that sometimes we don't have as professionals, especially when you make that leap. And you made that leap from Assurant to Trimble, where you are today, which is a huge thing for you to do, taking a lot of risk. Shocker, we're talking about risk, and you're taking a risk in your own career. So that's cool too. And there's a lot to chew on from what you described, a huge journey. You had a unique starting point in your world, coming from a totally different arena, studying God's word, the Bible, and then all the way into risk management. But with that said, let's take a step back. Can you tell me today, what would you describe? And we actually talked about this when we sat down for coffee. What would you describe in layman's terms what a risk manager does?
Yeah. So when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm in risk management, and then I usually have to follow that up with something else because it's not an intuitive thing when you say I do risk management. People don't really know what that means. And so
Mhm.
my simple explanation is I think about all the things that can go wrong in a corporation or a business, and I try to figure out how to make those things either not happen or to
Mhm.
make them less severe when they do.
Yeah.
And so I describe it as a healthy paranoia around thinking about, what's an insurable risk? What are risks where I can get some insurance and
Mhm.
transfer that risk? But the largest risks generally are not insurable risks. They are risks that insurance is not an appropriate product for. They're things around strategy. They're things around operational processes. They're things around your audit and financial control environment. And so those are the things that you have to think about. These can be internal risks from inside the corporation. They can be externally. They can be macroeconomic in nature. And so when you start to really unravel that, there's a plethora of risks that face any company at a time. But I think what good risk managers do is they don't sort of miss the forest for the trees.
Mhm.
They really begin to prioritize what risks they need to be looking at, what's critical and important, and what's sort of extraneous and can be handled elsewhere. And I think any good risk manager will be able to prioritize, the top risks that really you need to be focused on.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Because for you, you're taking care of the insurance side, yes, and looking at the things that can be avoided. But at the same time, you're also looking for those things that nobody's really thinking about. What can you protect the castle, so to speak, from? How can you protect the castle from invaders that have come from anywhere in the world, or something that just nobody has an eye on? So you always have to be thinking about the worst case scenario in a way, as well as the things that happen day to day that could occur in the business. So that's interesting stuff. Can you tell me something that we can maybe chew on? What is like a specific example or story that you had to see the unforeseen in your world?
Oof. Yeah, that's a tough one. I
Mhm.
think one of the emerging risks that I've been sort of focused on here lately is around the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So
Mhm.
if you'll remember, sort of in 2020 to 2021, there was a lot of civil unrest in the United States in response to a lot of high profile, tragic circumstances
Mhm.
that occurred with a lot of racial aspects behind it. And
Right.
that pushed a lot of corporations to move very heavily into investment around diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And environmental, social, and governance is sort of the broader umbrella of that, where companies are now taking into account not just shareholder value, but all stakeholder value. And so the environmental, social, and governance perspective really starts to take all those stakeholders and say, look, the environment's important. What we do from a culture perspective is important, both internally and externally in the countries that we operate. And the governance that we have needs to be reflective of the people that we're serving. And when you look at those sort of risks, there's all sorts of goals and objectives that companies are now putting forward around their ESG initiatives, and particularly around that DEI component. And that's been sort of escalating, I would say, the last 2 to 3 years. We've seen a lot of good, positive improvement there. But on the flip side of that, what we're now beginning to see is sort of an adverse reaction to some of those elements coming in. You've got states attorney generals who are now coming out saying you can't do DEI initiatives. You can't provide a quota on the types of people ethnically or racially or background wise that you want. And so those are the kind of things that when you look at these emerging risks, you think, wow, we're making a lot of good positive improvement
Mhm.
in terms of the makeup of our workforce and who we're hiring. But then someone comes along and says, oh, wait a minute, you can't really do it that way, or there's a lot of backlash. That's an emerging risk that I think is going to continue to play out over the coming years. I think it's important that companies continue to stay focused on their DEI initiatives, but they have to do it in accordance with the letter of the law, and with making sure that the stakeholders have very clear perspective and transparency on what the real goals are and how do we actually get there.
And it sounds like the obstacle here is, hey, you've got traditional affirmative action style, as you said, ESG. How do you combat that specific obstacle? What do you do when that comes into the arena for you? What initiatives do you have to take? What stakeholders do you have to enlist to help you out? And what are your next moves strategy wise for something like that?
Yeah, so I think the critical things to keep in mind is risk management doesn't occur in a vacuum. As a risk manager or director of risk management, you have to stay really plugged into your top senior VP and C-suite level leaders. Now, that tends to be a very real challenge for most risk managers. It's tough to break into that space, but I think most risk managers, if they learn to ask really good questions of their VPs, senior VPs, and C-suite leaders, they will start to get those opportunities more readily. When you're tapped into the pulse of your C-suite and senior VP level leadership by asking really good questions, you can kind of get a sense for what they're focused on. And then you can also share what are some emerging risks that we're seeing. The other element that you have to do as a risk manager is continually stay educated and up to date on legal proceedings that are happening in the area. So that might be certain legal articles that you're following. RIMS as a national organization has really good information on this. If you also talk to your carrier partners and your broker partners and say, what are some of the things that we're seeing? What I always like to do is learn from other companies' missteps or from other companies getting sued rather than, myself. And so you learn a lot from that type of litigation. You also learn a lot from stakeholders kind of coming in and saying, here's the concerns that we have over, whatever, whether that's a science-based target from an environmental perspective. So these are all things that are moving pretty quickly, but you have to keep your feelers out there. You have to keep your social and professional connections intact in order to get the information. I always say that a good risk manager is not a specialist. They're a generalist, but they know a lot of specialists in the areas that they're not necessarily, super knowledgeable about. So maintaining that sort of professional network gets you the access to that knowledge and information that you need to be a good risk manager.
That's good. You're paying attention to what's going on within your own company. You're continuing to build a relationship with your lateral employees as well as your higher ups. You're paying attention to the legalities involved. You're paying attention to, as you said, the other companies that have been sued so you don't make the same mistakes. And you're paying attention and networking with continued experts in the field, RIMS association members, and those in the space. Who specifically, if we could take a quick step back and maybe talk about specifically who has helped you, aside from your wife, Tricia, in your career in the space of risk management along the way?
Yeah. So I would say a huge shout out goes to Pete Naderer, who was the president of the Cincinnati RIMS chapter going back a couple of presidencies now. So when I first came into this space, I knew that I had to close that knowledge gap when I first came to Trimble and figure out what is it I don't know, what is it I need to know, and how do I close that gap? So Pete, as the president of Cincinnati RIMS at the time, reached out and introduced himself to me, invited me to come to chapter events. And those chapter events really started for me to close that knowledge gap, to expand my professional network in an area I wasn't necessarily well positioned to take advantage of the collective wisdom around me. And so Pete Naderer at Cincinnati Children's, a fantastic person. If any of you have never met Pete, he's an exceptional person, very giving of his own knowledge and wisdom. And Pete is really one of the key players that sort of set me on a path where I could expand my network more effectively.
That's great. And we'd love to have Pete on as a guest to pick his brain about risk management on Cincinnati RIMS roll call. So Pete, if you're watching, this is your opportunity to reach out. That's awesome. We love to hear about the stories where people have been mentored and get knowledge from other people in the association. Aside from working with other people, what moves would you say have also helped you grow your career? Is it that move going from Assurant to Trimble, or is there something specifically you risked to make that move that would help you grow in your role today?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements that a good risk manager has to do is they have to continually build their knowledge, and a lot of times building that knowledge is rather boring. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you've ever seen a commercial general liability insurance policy, it is not a fun read, I can assure you. Same goes for property insurance, workers' compensation policies, but all too often, the key to knowledge is doing the drudge work necessary to gain that knowledge. And so one of the first things I did is I read every single policy that Trimble had word for word. And as I did that, I wrote down questions and I would go to my broker and I would say, what does this mean? Why is this important? What about this? And I just peppered them with questions. They probably got sick of me for the first couple of years. But doing that sort of drudge work and doing the work necessary to build that knowledge base is critically important. The other thing I do is I get textbooks. So I look at curriculum that's online. I can usually get a syllabus or two from risk management courses at some of the universities. And I will look at their textbook syllabus and I will say, okay, what here might apply? And I'll go out and I'll grab a textbook and I'll read it. And it's not fun, but it is incredibly enriching in terms of your perspective. Business continuity was something I wasn't familiar with when we first launched that program. So I went out and I got a consultant to help us with that. And I peppered them with questions and I read on everything I could on the topic. So a lot of times, if you're interested in the topic, it's easy to gain that knowledge, even if it's difficult, because you're interested in it, you're going to find the resources and you're going to close the knowledge gap that you have. So that's kind of my perspective on that. I'm always trying to seek and to learn. One of the people that I'm following now that I think just has a dynamite perspective on enterprise risk management is Sim Segal. And he's got a book out called The Corporate Value of Enterprise Risk Management. I would highly recommend it. It is a deep read, but it's immensely practical. And so if you're struggling to get an enterprise risk management program up and running, that is a fantastic resource. Sim is the professor of the Columbia University Enterprise Risk Management Program. He's incredibly smart. He has a plethora of resources on his website as well. So it's just about how do you get the information, and you get the information by doing the work necessary to educate yourself.
Great. Continual learning, reading all the things that you can possibly get your hands on so that you know the minutia and the ins and outs of your job, as well as continuing to educate yourself in a traditional path, finding the syllabuses and books and texts that you can read so that you can be the best in your career, in your world. So I love to hear it. And it's certainly something I think our audience can tune into and be like, I got to steal that move. If you haven't already, try that out. I love it. So that's wonderful. Taking a quick shift here, David, and you've given us some great stories and bits and pieces of information. As president now of Cincy Rims, we talked a little bit about strategy, and maybe this is a good time to talk to the audience about the Cincy Rims strategy in the near future. If you can think of what you might want to say to the audience about Cincy Rims and what you want to see from the group and the association, I guess now would be the time. Talk to us about that.
Well, Cincy Rims has a rich history and has contributed immensely to my own professional growth. And so I stand on the shoulders of some really key people in my career through my connections with Cincy Rims. And so shout out to all the presidents and board members who have sort of come before and built this out. I have had the privilege of working with some incredible people, but when I came into Cincy Rims, I wanted to refine the strategy a little bit and understand, why is it that we exist? What's our mandate? And so when I think about Cincy Rims, what I really think about the core is the risk manager role within a company. That could also be the insurance buyer in a company. And oftentimes that might be the CFO, or it might be the treasurer. They may not have a qualified risk manager on staff because they might not be large enough for that. But that's the role that we focus on and we concentrate on. When we focus on that core, we bring along a lot of others in the space. We bring along the brokers, the carriers, the consultants like yourself with Gravitas Investigations. But we focus really on that core. We focus on educating and empowering our members to be more effective risk managers. And we do that through opportunities for professional networking, social networking, and also through highly relevant and engaging educational sessions as well. So some of the key elements that we were looking at from an objective standpoint is we wanted to grow our membership to 100 members. So when I first came on board, I think when Pete was the president, we were around 60. We're about 97 now. So we're only about 3 off of our goal, which is really important. The other thing is the financial viability of the chapter has to be secure. And I'll say that Amy Townsend, the immediate prior president of Cincy Rims, did a fantastic job of making sure that we were financially viable for the long term. And so huge shout out to her for, making us to a place where we can do some really important and awesome things because our financial state is in a much healthier place. I think the other thing too is I think about we have a lot of adjacent organizations in Cincinnati that we've partnered with to increase our marketability. So we've partnered with SWOSHA, the Greater Cincinnati Insurance Board, Gamma Iota Sigma. We've partnered with the NAAIA, which is the National African American Insurance Association, which, if you didn't know, was started in Cincinnati. So we've got a lot of adjacent organizations that we're cross-marketing, cross-pollinating, CPCU Society, and that has given us a much broader reach, as well as helped us to partner more effectively to build those organizations out as well. We all have a common theme and a common purpose in this risk and insurance management space. So it's important that we leverage our partners.
Yeah, awesome stuff. And you said standing on the shoulders of giants, standing on the mentors that came before you, became for me, and continue to lift up the people that are currently a part of the association, and then also cross-marketing and working with other associations out there, because we're all kind of in this together. So I love that stuff. And thanks for letting me be a part of this, because as you know, I'm kind of new to this space personally, and you guys entrusted me with a little bit of the being a part of the board, as well as doing the social media stuff. So I'm glad to be a part of it. And thanks for shouting out to the previous presidents, Pete and Amy and more. So awesome stuff. David, you're very well spoken, but now we're going to come to a point where I'm going to lay up some softball questions. Cincy Rims rapid fire. Now's the time. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
Okay. Firstly, the big question: Gold Star or Skyline chili for you?
Oof. Okay. So it depends on the mood. I like to qualify Skyline chili as having a little sweeter, more cinnamony taste. Mm-hmm. And Gold Star has a little bit more of a savory flavor. So if I need something just a hair sweeter, I'm going to go with Skyline. If I need something a little more savory, I'm going to go with Gold Star. But I like them both.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You described it well. From an outsider not having chili, you might say the exact same thing. Sweeter if you want to go Skyline, a little cinnamon, a little chocolate. Gold Star for a little savory. All right. What high school did you go to, David?
I went to a private high school in Dayton, Ohio called Wesleyan Christian Academy. It's no longer in existence, but I was the proud salutatorian of a graduating class of 5. And so there wasn't a lot of competition. I wasn't a great student, but I was good enough. So
I've never met anybody who went to high school and only graduated under single digits. I've heard, 10 to 100, somewhere in there, but that's rural area in Dayton. That's interesting. Well, I might have to chew on that a little bit later. Reds, Bengals, or FCC, David?
Oh, I'm a huge Bengals fan, have been for many years. So I love the Reds. I've not had a chance to go to an FCC game, but hopefully in the near future.
Yeah, likewise. All right, well, that wraps it up. David, is there anybody else you'd like to shout out to? Any other pieces of wisdom? It's been wonderful hearing your story. Talk to me about anything else you'd like to let the audience know today.
Well, Adam, I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. Love what you've done with the Cincy Rims Roll Call series. So big shout out to you for hosting this and making it as professional as it is. So thanks so much for having me on.
David, it's been a pleasure having you. Thanks for entrusting me to run Cincy Rims Roll Call. Again, my name's Adam Visnick. Thanks for allowing me to be your host. We'll catch you next time.